Everybody for joining us for our R2v3 marathon series read-alongs. This is our session 2. We're going to be talking about section 2 of R2 standard, provision 2. The language is still
core requirement 2.
Yeah, I'm still trying to go back to, learn, right? The core requirements, hierarchy of responsible management strategies. And compared to our session 1, where we had Asal read the whole section and then we discussed it, from now on, the outline is going to be, Asal is going to read one snippet by snippet of each section, and after each snippet we're going to have a discussion, because I think that we all agree that might have been more effective. So let's get started. Asal?
So I'm going to dive into the general principles of core requirement number 2, the hierarchy of responsible management strategies. If you have your R2v3 standard, please get it out right now. You can take notes on it as we go through this section, core requirement 2. General principle: to develop and adhere to a policy for managing used and end-of-life electronic equipment, components, and materials that is based on a hierarchy of responsible management strategies, prioritizing reuse first, followed by materials recovery for recycling into new products. So let's talk about the hierarchy.
So I think that this is really nothing new. R2, of course, the idea is that we want to make the most use of all of the electronic devices that we have. So if they're obsoleted to you in your household, and they're collected, at your facility, then we want to make sure that you are maximizing the reuse of the electronics, because we want to minimize, waste at the end of the day, right? That is the hierarchy. This is the hierarchy that was there also before in previous 2 versions. So I don't think that in terms of this general principle, there is really anything to add to that. Mike?
Yeah, right. Mike, go ahead. Sorry.
No, I think Maya is correct. I think this is a pretty solid principle from the beginning of R2, and it continues.
When a company has to prioritize reuse first, what kind of cost-benefit analysis are they obliged to present to determine, at what point can I not reuse this equipment? How much money do I have to put into this before I consider this salvage for parts?
So yeah, all of that depends. If there's it takes an hour of work to salvage a $5 piece of equipment, then maybe that's not worthwhile.
Do I have to justify this, or am I just protected by a business judgment rule that says that it is assumed that I am prioritizing reuse in my operations?
The business judgment rule, I don't know if that really applies to people who are getting certified here, because, they're adhering to the reuse, recover, dispose hierarchy of managing electronics. So if there's any type of potential reuse and you can show that it's feasible and economical, then you should be able to divert that to those proper channels of reuse.
Okay.
And to add on to that, I think actually the market itself speaks to this, because, for example, some of the computers like Core 2s, right? They're completely obsoleted. Nobody wants them anymore. And that is kind of a general industry knowledge, right? So it just makes sense that that's going to go for demanufacturing, right? For demand, but then you have to show that the next step of the process is the recovery, right? Mm-hmm. So you have to the boards that are coming out are going to a recovery, to the recovery downstream. So those are the kinds of things that when you are within the industry, and if you are auditing the industry, and if you're a consultant within the industry, then that is just general knowledge that you have. And I don't think CIRI or any certification body wants to punish an organization for maximizing the profit, all right? As long as they can demonstrate the reuse is the first step.
Okay. So I'm going to read the subsection A now. We're going to dive into the text. An R2 facility shall develop in writing and adhere to a policy stating how it manages used and end-of-life electronic equipment, components, and materials. With respect to off-site and off-site activities, as well as the selection of downstream vendors, that is based on a hierarchy of responsible management strategies. So please.
Oh, go ahead.
No, so let's talk about that.
Yeah, so this is simply, let's write a policy. Let's write a policy to make sure that we are adhering to this principle, and how are we managing end-of-life electronic equipment, components, and materials, so everything, right? And on-site and off-site. So the off-site, right, we want to say something to the fact that we are only using approved downstream vendor, our approved downstream vendors, or only vendors who are R2 certified or have documented EHS management system. So we just have to make sure that we document our policy, which then is going to adhere to core requirements 2. And with that said, most organizations that are transitioning would just maybe need to edit their policy unless they already meet this requirement. So again, I don't think there is much of a change from the previous version here.
Okay. Mike, anything to add?
I think it's slightly larger in scope, just like how the scope was in core requirement 1, because now you're including within this hierarchy the off-site and on-site activities, as well as selection of downstream vendors. So are you sending stuff that's ready to repair? Are you kind of checking to see if they're able and capable of repair, or are you just kind of shipping it off to them, and then letting it see what's done with the material, so it's kind of holding people accountable for all the activities that are done, including, any potential reuse repair activities done by other people off-site or downstream vendors when there's no potential reuse.
Okay.
But I would like to say that, Mike, right, in terms of implementation, it's just a change in the policy, and you can just add these words in the policy and then they will be audited, of course, to make sure that you adhere to that.
Yes.
So
it's just an expansion upon like the written portion of their system.
Okay. So subsection B, we're going to get into the actual hierarchy now. An R2 facility shall evaluate and sort equipment, components, and material in accordance with the policy and core requirement number 6, and take all practical steps to direct items for processing in the following order of preference. Number 1, reuse. Number 2, materials recovery. And number 3, disposal. So we could talk about subsection B real quick first, and then get into the actual order of preferences. What do you guys think?
Yeah, that's good for me. So I'll just take this first sentence. It says, an R2 facility shall evaluate, sort equipment, components, and materials. And I think one of the things that we haven't talked about or we haven't introduced, because if anybody's new to reading standards, right? Anything where we say shall is kind of like reading and you must do this, right? So here, what's R2 core requirement 2 directs organizations that they must do is you have to evaluate and sort equipment, components, and material in accordance with the policy and core requirement 6, which we will go into later. But I want to point out when, in order for the organization to demonstrate that they are meeting this requirement, best practice here would be to document your process and or procedure, right? Mm-hmm. So we need to see, okay, so most organizations have some kind of a form of initial inspection or audit process, right? Where you audit the equipment that's coming in. Mm-hmm. And that is your evaluation point, right? This is when you're saying like, oh, I have these I7s and I9s and I'm going to route it for further testing and reuse, right? But then I have all these core 2s and I'm going to evaluate them and I'm going to send them to recovery, right? So there has to be some kind of a process of intake of, what is the process for that? So that should be documented in a procedural process somewhere. Because then whether it is, your customers, certification body, or your external internal auditors coming in to audit to see whether you meet this requirement, then you have the document, and then you can show to anybody that you do have the process written, and then you can show the records from that process to show the conformance to it. Right. And so that's kind of like my little 2 cents. That was more like 10 cents on the first sentence.
And I just want to clarify that for our listeners, core requirement number 6 is the core requirement that talks about sorting, categorization, and processing. So we're going to get into the details of that later on. So in case you were wondering about what that was. So let's talk about reuse. So the first hierarchy, the first category, we should prioritize reuse. So subsection B1, reuse. For all equipment and components capable of reuse, the R2 facility shall direct the items to a reuse process meeting the requirements of the R2 standard. However, equipment and components that are not legal to sell, such as lost or stolen, counterfeit, or recalled equipment, shall not be reused and instead directed to materials recovery. So listen, it is not lost on me that this does not say reuse as long as it's economically feasible. So with the iteration of this standard, like what do you think is going to happen? Do you think that we are going to have to really send everything we could possibly for reuse, or do you think that there will be some sort of leeway where, according to industry knowledge, for example, we don't have to try to reuse core 2s? Just when we do our receiving inspection, we just automatically send them for recovery.
I think I'm going to leave that to Mike.
Okay, so if you go to the definition section, and I think what Maya was talking about previously about evaluate. Evaluate is a very important word, because evaluate in the definition refers to a variety of activities designated to assess various aspects of equipment or components to determine reuse potential. So reuse potential suggests that it's both based upon the functionality, cosmetic, and market for that potential piece of equipment or components. So it's not just, during the evaluation process, you want to think about first, is this capable of reuse? If the answer is yes, then the second question should be, does it have a market? And if it does, is it worth the time to put into repairing this? What's the return on investment? So it's a business decision. It has to always be a business decision. If a business is losing money because they have to reuse every little piece of equipment or component that comes into their facility, then the R2 standard wouldn't work. So there is a business angle to this. People need to be able to evaluate and make a determination based upon business. What are the channels and the markets for this type of equipment and material, and then go from there.
Okay.
Another consideration too, if it is capable of reuse, but it's not worth it, does it also have any data? Is it data bearing? Because then it is directed to data destruction of some sort.
Right. So a follow-up question is, who has the authority to make the determination that this is not an economically feasible reuse for this type of material?
I mean, that's why you have to have a defined process.
Mm-hmm.
The top management is responsible for ultimately the management system, right? And then flowing down to the people who are either techs or auditors or whomever you have in your reuse department, evaluating the equipment and material and making a determination based upon the business's processes, decided by top management whether or not this is going into the stream of reuse or going elsewhere.
And talk about the documentation requirement for those decisions.
Documentation requirement. Well, if we're talking about the documentation requirement, there's nothing specifically or explicitly stated. It says that you shall have develop in writing a policy. It doesn't say anything about you have to document your process for evaluation. I mean, it's probably a best practice, but I don't see that it's required by the standard.
That Mike is right that that's not required by the standard, but I think what Asal is getting at is how do you implement what is your cutoff, right? So I think, Asal, that would be in your SOPs related to auditing or like the initial inspection or the review or the receiving inspection of different types of goods, right? So for example, you're going to have an SOP on initial inspection or auditing or of computers, right? And so there's going to be probably some kind of a checklist or some kind of a list of things that you're going to be looking for. And, it can just simply say like, if this version, then it is going to be sent for reuse, or like if less than this version is going to be sent for recovery. Same thing, for example, with your what are they called, LCDs, right? When you're inspecting the LCDs, they may be powering on, but if the screen is completely shattered, it's going to go to the recovery, right? So there has to be some kind of a procedure for each type of electronic device that you are receiving that is going to define what is your cutoff.
Okay.
And those things are very fluid too. Those lists change frequently depending upon the market, stuff that is hot commodities or hot items coming in, or stuff that's selling, or that, buyers are looking for. The business development team or management might say, hey, when you guys are doing your evaluations, look for this equipment. If any of this comes in, set it aside, so on and so forth. So those things should be fluid based upon market conditions and streams of material.
Yeah,
exactly. And Mike is right on that. And that's why there's no requirement to define that in a process or a procedure. That's why it's more of a lower level SOP that can be changed more often, because the idea is once you implement the R2, you don't want to change your processes, your policies all the time, right? Versus, lower level tasks that may be changed from month to month or depending on what the economic situation is.
Great. Okay. Any thoughts on the illegal goods? Why is it not okay to reuse illegal goods, but it is okay for materials recovery? Why do you think that that's in there?
Because there's probably a prohibition for it to be resold. It's recalled because it doesn't work properly, right? So it shouldn't be reused.
So yeah,
right? It's counterfeit, so you shouldn't be putting counterfeit electronics out into the marketplace, right? Mm-hmm. If it's lost or stolen, then the idea is don't be a bad actor. So all of these types of things should not go into the reuse stream, and instead they should be broken down to the component level and recycled because of the ramifications of putting like recalled equipment or counterfeit equipment back into the reuse stream.
And most of the time, this is going to be part of your MSA, master service agreement with whoever you're receiving this equipment from, right? Unless you're discovering, some kind of a cell phone that comes in and you're like, oh, this is a stolen cell phone. And, you got to do what you got to do. But most of the time, let's say you have an agreement to destroy equipment, it's going to be part of your contract already, and you have to meet the requirements of the contract. Therefore, you're going to do that destruction, right? Because no customer, knowing that something is counterfeit, is going to give it to you and say, oh, okay, yeah, you can resell this, right?
Sure.
So most of the time, it's going to be already pre-written and full knowledge to you.
Right. Okay, so materials recovery. For equipment and components not capable of reuse, the R2 facility shall direct the items to a materials recovery process, meeting the requirements of the R2 standard for recycling.
So I think this is very straightforward in terms of material recovery, right?
Yeah. I think that we're going to get really into materials recovery later on when we're talking about focus materials.
Yeah.
Okay. Anything to add to this, Mike, before we move on to disposal?
No, I mean, this doesn't need to be done by the facility itself if they don't have that capability. If they're really focusing on reuse, they can just send the whole unit that's not working to a qualified downstream vendor that tears it down and breaks it up to the component commodity level. So, yeah, that's up to the recycler or the R2 facility, I should say, to decide how they're going to manage non-reuse material.
Okay. So disposal. Disposal is broken down into two sections, A and B. A is with regards to focus material. Energy recovery, incineration, or land disposal shall not be used as a management strategy for focus material or equipment and components containing focus material unless applicable law requires the use of a specific technology. However, if documented extreme and rare circumstances beyond the control of the R2 facility disrupts its normal management of focus material, it may consider using these technologies to the extent allowed under applicable law until normal management is again possible. So I think we should start with defining focus material. And I know there is a list.
Yes, there's a list. It's CRTs, circuit board or circuit board containing devices, PCBs, polychlorinated biphenyls, mercury and mercury containing items, and that's it. Batteries as well. Yeah, I forgot to mention that one.
I just thought you did. Sorry. So yeah, so PCBs, polychlorinated biphenyls, mercury, CRT glass, batteries, and circuit boards. You got it all. But I don't think this requirement is not new. This requirement is exactly the same as it was before. Maybe just defined a little bit more precisely. So if you've had R2 before, if you're certified to R2 right now, there should be no changes to your system and the way that you're handling FMs right now, unless there is some kind of a directive like it was in California. Hey, you can landfill the CRTs, right? But other than that, there's really no change. When you're implementing this, you just have to make sure that the FMs that you're handling are going for, they're not going for incineration. They're actually going more for recovery.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so this is saying that basically, so for instance, alkaline batteries are non-hazardous. So they can go to the landfill, but you shouldn't use that as a management strategy. you have to figure out some other strategy for managing those things. In the state of California, you're allowed to landfill CRT glass, both the panel glass and the funnel glass at the hazardous waste landfill. However, if there's other options, the applicable law doesn't require you to use this specific technology. It doesn't say landfilling is the only option. It gives you the ability to do that. But if there's some other way to do it, you know, like glass to lead, sending it to a lead smelter where they can recover it, or some other alternative recycling, then that is the way that you need to prioritize the management of those focus materials. For instance, there's specific things saying that PCBs need to be incinerated. That's like one of the only, you know, examples that I can think of offhand of a focus material that requires a specific strategy by law.
Right.
You know, but other ones, you're not allowed to manage it that way. You have to figure out another strategy. So I think that's the main point here. And like Maya said, this is pretty much verbatim what was in the 2013 standard.
Okay. So again, so just because the law allows certain activities does not mean that you are required to follow those activities.
Yeah, in fact, you're not. You have to do it in accordance with the R2 standard and the hierarchy of managing used electronics. You know.
So I do want to. So for example, you do have to follow the law if it says this is the only way to handle it, right?
Right. The law.
But if the law says you can do this, but then you know there is another method and it's accessible to you and it's open to you, then yeah, you use that method, right? Yeah. But at the same time, if, for example, you know there are alternative ways to landfilling, but for some reason, you know, this market is not accessible to you, or it's not feasible, or it just doesn't make sense for whatever reason, that you have to demonstrate that landfilling is the best option for you and why.
Mm-hmm.
Okay?
Yes.
Okay. So how do I do that? How do you do that?
Write a descriptive paragraph in your focus materials management plan.
Okay.
Of why you're managing that type of focus material that way, and justify it.
Or identify it as a risk in your risk database, and write why your operational control is such. And also you can also have improvement projects that's open, that you're always searching or trying to find out a different way. So as long as you're showing something somewhere, somehow, that you are trying to do your best to you know, avoid incineration and landfill for FMs, then that too should be. So it's not just one way of showing that you're meeting this requirement. It's multiple different ways.
Okay. And what about extreme and rare circumstances that are beyond the control of the R2 facility? So this is kind of almost a catch-all, it sounds like, where, you know, there's an exception to the management of focus material if there are some sort of circumstance that makes it not feasible for an R2 facility to manage the focus material in the way that it should.
A good example of that, like the Glencore facility in Canada, stopped taking CRT glass for glass to lead smelting for, you know, whatever reason, business decision. They made a determination on that. If the other glass to lead smelters that are, you know, operating decide to stop taking CRT glass and there's no more alternative means, then the only way to manage CRT glass would be through landfilling, you know, because you have the 1 year accumulation time limit for this type of waste, and you need to, you know, well, it depends on how you're managing it. It might be hazardous waste or a universal waste depending on your operation. So I shouldn't say there's always a 1 year accumulation time limit depending on the management of the CRT. you have accumulation time limits. And so you need to get rid of it in a certain period of time. So that's the thing. If there's no outlets that are accept land disposal, then you can do that and until there presents a new avenue. But this is another thing where I said you really have to document that and write a good description in your focus materials management plan or elsewhere. I mean, I just think it's best in your focus materials management plan because you're going to be discussing how you manage that stream of material anyway. So a full description of why it's being managed this way for a certain period of time is appropriate there. It might be appropriate to do it in multiple places because it affects more than one area of your system.
Okay, cool. So non-focus material. Only when all opportunities for reuse or materials recovery have been exhausted and there are no technically viable recycling processes available, may an R2 facility direct material to the most environmentally beneficial option of energy recovery, incineration, or land disposal. So what is this saying? It's saying that non-focused material can be recycled however the corporation decides, right?
I would say wood. I would say I will use an example of wood, right? So for example, and paper, right? So it's wood paper, right? Or cardboard paper, whatever, paper and wood. So let's say one of the outputs from your process is that there's you accumulate wood, which is a non-focused material, right? So if you can demonstrate that there is any other way of recycling the wood other than sending it to energy recovery or to land disposal or incineration, then you can do that, right? However, for example, if you have aluminum cans or paper, right? It makes no sense for you to send it to energy recovery or to land disposal because there are recycling avenues for these types of non-focused materials.
Right.
So I think that's what this is the idea of this section.
And this is the same as the prior version of the standard, right?
No, this is new.
Okay.
There was no requirement to manage non-focused materials a certain way in the previous standard. So this is new, and I think it has to do a lot with the markets that have changed. A lot of things like ABS plastic and steel and cardboard and stuff have really lost the commodity value almost to nothing, to where it could be negative, and where there were no people taking certain material at certain times. So in an effort to try and make sure that that material is not just sent to the landfill because it doesn't have any value, you also now have the obligation, and you're certified to one of the environmental standards anyways, either under a RIOS or 14,001. So it should be part of your management strategy anyways to not landfill non-focused materials, prior to it explicitly stating it in the R2 standard anyways.
Right.
Most of the time you're going to get some kind of a payment from it. So in terms, why not maximize on the recycling, right?
Yeah, would it make sense not to do that? So is this going to change my focus material management plan? Now I have to account for non-focus material more deeply? Or would I just having a list, listing it out on my focus material management plan be sufficient of who my downstream vendors are for my non-focus material?
I think I would just have a flow chart, and then the same thing would saying, these are my downstream, these are my downstream vendors for my non-focus materials, and this is how I have approved them, which you can approve them not using your downstream vendor approval process, right? Because they are, focus materials downstream vendor process. So your downstream vendors, you're going to use a different type of method of approving them, but for non-focus materials, I think the approval may be a little bit easier. But because it's your focused materials management plan, I don't think it has to address non-focused materials management, but that would be the best place where you would define it.
Right.
Mike?
Yeah, I would only write it in my focused materials management plan if I was sending non-focused materials to energy recovery, incineration, or land disposal, and justify why.
Yeah.
If you're sending non-focused materials for recycling, then you don't really need to justify anything. But if you are sending them elsewhere, then I would just, again, document in a narrative why there's no technically viable recycling process available and why you're directing it to whatever option of energy recovery, incineration, or land disposal.
Yeah. Yeah. So justify it and document it as much as you can, right?
Exactly.
Cool. All right. So that brings us to the end of section 2.
Yeah.
Thank you for joining us. If you have any questions, I know we took a very deep dive. If you have any questions, please email us at info@glenviewgroup.com.
Yeah.
And
See you guys.
we'll see you for section 3.
Yeah, see you soon. Bye.